Today we're going to talk about the essential ingredients for plant growth. If you've ever made a recipe and accidentally put too much salt or too much hot pepper, you know that the quantity of specific ingredients is essential for getting the taste and texture that you want in your food. Same thing goes for plant growth. One ingredient, too much or too little, can totally mess up your plant's growth or even kill it. So let's dive into altering plant growth. Today we're specifically going to talk about greenhouses and their use. We can think of them like an oven for plant growth. My name is Mrs. Tessa Rose Mahmoudi. Let's get started. What do plants need to grow? Well, plants need water to grow, since they're 90% water. Plants also need light, since they use the energy from the sun to produce glucose through a process called photosynthesis, something we'll cover more later on. Plants also need nutrients, which is why fertilizing your plant is essential. These are the building blocks that plants use to construct plant parts and structures to do important functions such as photosynthesis, hormone production, protein production, etc. Plants also need air. We breathe out carbon dioxide, and plants take that up and produce glucose. Byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, which is essential for our breathing. Plants also need the right temperature to grow. Some plants are adapted to colder climates, while others need warmer temperatures to grow. Controlling these elements that are essential for plant growth is really important for having your plants be as productive and as healthy that you want. Affecting the amount of water is easy with your houseplants, but it's harder if you're growing a plant outside because you can't affect when it rains. Same thing goes for the sun. You can plant your plants in the shade or in the sun, which does affect that. But if you have a plant that's growing in an area that's not getting enough sun, you can't go out there and provide more sun for it. That's why we use greenhouses. It's also hard to control the temperature outside, so that's another use for greenhouses since some plants are adapted to warmer or cooler climates. We can also control the amount of nutrients in our soil by adding fertilizer, something that we can do indoors and outdoors. We talked about that plants need these essential things, but if they have too much of a good thing, it can also be harmful. Just like baking a cake at 350 degrees is great for, say, 30 minutes to an hour, but if you cook it longer than that, say 2 hours, it's going to be burnt and not be a successful cake. Same thing goes for the sun. Sun is important for plant growth. However, plants can also get sunburn. These are two pictures of plants that have gotten too much sun exposure. Nutrients are also essential for plant growth, but if the plant has too much nutrients, they can have symptoms as well. This is an over-fertilization of the bromeliads right here. And this is a clover plant that has too much nitrogen but not enough phosphorus. We'll talk about nutrient deficiencies later on and identifying what nutrient your plant is either deficient in or has excess. Temperature is critical, something that we like to manage in greenhouses. If it's too hot, plants will use a lot of water and end up running out of water, which can cause death, as you can see here. This is common in hot climates in the summer if it's not raining. Plants can also get too cold of temperatures, which damages their cellular structures. These are some pictures of a cactus that I used to have, but I left it outside in the winter and it died. So this is a picture after it was outside too much. These two plants were also left outside and they had cold damage, but they didn't die. So they had damage to their cell structures, but they were able to recover after a few weeks. Too much water can also be damaging to plants. This is really common if people are growing succulent plants, usually a very easy plant to grow, but if you overwater it, it can cause the roots of that plant to be attacked by fungus that's naturally in the soil and cause your plants to die. This is also common in aloe vera plants, along with other succulents. So there's a perfect place to be able to control these factors, and that is a greenhouse. We can also control these things in our homes, but there's a limit of how many plants we can have in our homes depending on our situation. So greenhouses are special structures that we use to provide the perfect growing environments for plants so that we can have more productive, beautiful plants. So greenhouse, the definition, is a climate-controlled glass or clear plastic enclosed structure where young, tender, or out-of-season plants are cultivated and protected. A tender plant basically means a plant that is not very tolerant to the weather that's going on outdoors. So let's talk a little bit more about why greenhouses are important or something that horticulturists invest in. They can be very economically beneficial because you can have more productive plants, you can increase your yield, or grow a plant that you would have otherwise not been able to grow. They also are really fun places to escape the winter climate or enter basically an enclosure that you can have plants that are very exotic. They provide protection for the plants. You can extend the growing season of your plant so you can either get higher yields or grow a plant that you would have not been able to grow in that season. You can also, for certain plants, as we said, have higher quality or production. Greenhouses are also an excellent place where science can happen. So this is a picture of the former Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, talking to USDA, or United States Department of Agriculture, scientists. This picture was taken at the University of Minnesota at the Cereal Disease Laboratory, where I used to work. In this picture, it's showing some science that's going on throughout the year at this specific research location. They are inoculating wheat plants with a disease, and then they're seeing which plants are resistant to the disease. This is extremely important because if we understand which plants are resistant or able to fight against that disease, then we can encourage farmers to plant those. This is really a great use of greenhouse, since this picture was taken in the wintertime where it's not possible to grow wheat in the Minnesota climate. Greenhouses are better than, for certain uses, than growth chambers. Growth chambers are rooms that we use to grow plants that artificial light is given to the plants, but that can be really expensive because you have to pay for the electricity for those growth lights. So greenhouses sometimes have growth lights in them to provide additional lights for the plants, but greenhouses also take advantage of the sun since they are glass or plastic, so that they're allowing the sunshine to come in. There's lots of different types of greenhouses which we're going to cover. There are lots of different styles, and they have different uses and different prices. Some greenhouses are detached, basically that they're standing on their own, versus there's other greenhouses that are attached to another building. So we have three different types of detached greenhouses. We have even span greenhouses, uneven span, and Quonset types. So the even span basically means that they have straight sides, two sides that are equal. These side walls decrease the rate of heat loss and give greater stability. However, there is, a result of the straight edges, there is shaded areas underneath the benches, which basically means that there's certain areas of these structures that we can't grow plants in easily. Even span greenhouses have two main types. The first one is high profile or American, which you can see that it's basically have straight edges. And then the other one is the Dutch-lit greenhouse, which is constructed at a slight angle because the absence of sidewalls and the angle of the glass makes these types of greenhouses slightly brighter. Dutch lit greenhouses are common at botanical gardens or big atriums where they want maximum light in the structure. There's also uneven span greenhouses, which has one side of the greenhouse roof have a larger surface area. This is perfect for the side of a hill or an area where one side of the greenhouse would never get any light. So one roof is wider than the other. There's different angles of the pitch. It's used on hillsides. It's not quite as popular, but it can be really good for a side hill, as I mentioned. The side where there's more surface area is usually pointed south, since there's more heat units can be gathered from that direction. The last type that we'll talk about for the standalone greenhouses is the Quonset greenhouse or high tunnel. These are really common for vegetable or fruit production. They're usually made out of pretty inexpensive materials, so it's more accessible for farmers to buy. They're usually made of bent pipe with one or more layers of plastic film covering them. These are not for the middle of winter in a cold climate, but these are usually used in the fall or the springtime to extend the growing season. There's an article linked here, which is where I got this picture from, that gives a lot more information about high tunnel systems. And then we have our attached greenhouses. These ones are connected to another building. There's three basic types: lean-to, ridge furrow, and barrel vault. The first one you may have seen at a school, and these are attached to either a school building or your home, and these are a little bit less expensive to build because you do not have to build that fourth wall. They're usually south-facing, since that's where you can gather the most sunshine, and they're convenient and aesthetically pleasing to the eye. These can also be built off of your home if you have a sliding glass window, and then you can even use the heat from your home to heat that attached lean-to. You can even extend a living area by building one of these. These are usually attached to the south side, but east or west facing lean-to greenhouses can also be helpful. Just take note of the type of plants that you want to grow in there. North facing greenhouses can be used for shade-loving plants, since you won't get as much sun. The next type is ridge and furrow greenhouses. This is a bunch of greenhouses basically attached. They are even span structures placed next to each other. This is for large research centers, since you can save money by not having to build that fourth wall, attaching them, and they're also used in large productions. Barrel vault greenhouses are very similar to the ridge and furrow, except these are made out of lean-to, so the tops of these greenhouses are rounded. There's really cool ventilation systems that are used for those barrel vault greenhouses. I just wanted to show you this to introduce the idea that ventilation in greenhouses is very important, because just like in your house, if you don't have circulation of the air, it can get pretty humid and damp, and that's the perfect recipe for having fungal growth, which is really harmful to plants. So we want to make sure greenhouses have ventilation systems. Since we've gone through some of these greenhouses, we're now going to go through 3 case studies to examine what type of greenhouse would be good for different scenarios. So we're going to go through them after I explain the scenario. I'll be pretending that I have each of these scenarios going on. You can pause the video and write down which greenhouse you think would be the right choice. Alright, so what greenhouse do you recommend for me? So I'm a farmer and I grow tomatoes and I sell them at a farmer's market. But the problem is that my tomatoes don't start as early as some other people's, and I know that people are willing to pay more for tomatoes if they're there earlier in the year. is, as I said, it's too cold for me to grow my tomatoes and plant them earlier. My budget is pretty low, but I have a lot of land to grow or to build a greenhouse. So what type of greenhouse do you recommend to me? If you said Quonset or hoop house greenhouse, you're correct. These are great for growing tomatoes and other vegetables and fruit production. The second case study. I am a horticulturist wannabe. I have been growing microgreens in my family's house for a few months now. My family really likes it, and I found a few neighbors to buy my microgreens. But the problem is my mom is getting frustrated because our living room and our kitchen is full of trays where I'm growing microgreens. She says that she appreciates not having to buy lettuce as often, but she said that I have to move them. I don't have much space because our home is really small and we have a small lot and my budget is pretty low. What type of greenhouse do you recommend for me? If you said a lean-to greenhouse, that's an excellent idea. Lean-to greenhouses are really helpful for growing a small amount of things such as a high-value crop such as microgreens. But where should I get this? Depending on how big your budget is, for example, some lean-to greenhouses can be purchased and are quite expensive, but you can also build your own. I have linked here and later on in this lecture to many do-it-yourself greenhouses so that you can find a greenhouse that fits your budget. Now we're going to go over the types of structures that you'll find within a greenhouse. I want you to know these just so that you're familiar with the terms. So this is a graphic of a greenhouse, and we're going to go over the different parts. So this is a shelving or staging, an area where you plant, put soil in your pots and plant your seeds. This is the eaves, this line right here. As we discussed, ventilation is very important, so every greenhouse should have a roof vent. The ridge is the top of the greenhouse, where the two sides come together. And then the gutter is where water is collected. Glazing bar is the bars between the glazing. The glazing is the glass or the plastic, whatever you use as the glazing material. Basically, the see-through material is called the glazing. So these are all of the different parts that you should know. The circled ones will be required for you to know. Another structure I want you to become familiar with is a head house. If you work in a research lab, you'll probably spend a lot of time in a head house planting seeds or propagating plants for sale in a nursery. This is a structure that's usually attached or right next to a greenhouse used for management and plant preparations. As we mentioned, the glazing is the see-through part of the greenhouse that allows light through. There's different types of glazing. It can be glass or very transparent, letting more light in. There's also some types of glazing that are less transparent and let less light in. These are really helpful in areas that have a lot of light, especially in the summertime, because if you have too much light coming in, that can be damaging to your plants. So some greenhouses, they'll actually do something called whitewashing in the summertime, which is putting a very watered down amount of paint on the entire greenhouse, which basically reduces the amount of light that's able to come in. They can then scrape off this whitewashing in the wintertime and at the time when there's less light, sunlight coming through. Some other structures that can be used for growing plants are shade houses. These are often used at, say, Walmart or Lowe's or Home Depot, somewhere where you're building a temporary structure to sell and grow plants out of. These will reduce the amount of light, which increases the amount of diversity of plants that you can grow out there, since some plants cannot handle a high amount of light. So shade houses are just constructed to reduce the amount of sunlight in that specific area. we know that shade is really nice to be in. So this is great for the people that are purchasing your plants and also for the plants themselves, depending on their light requirements. Some plants require more light. You can buy shade cloth with different percentages, 50% meaning letting 50% of the light in, 50% being shaded. A higher percentage of the shade cloth means that it's letting less light in. So you want to think about which percent you want to buy. A lath house is kind of like a shade house, but it's constructed with wood. The same idea as reducing the amount of light and shading those plants, providing a growing structure for plants that require less light. Basically artificial shade. Cold frames are like mini greenhouses that are used to extend the growing season. So these are awesome for starting fruits and vegetables early on in the year when it's still too cold to have your seeds out there. We're now going to go through some practice questions. After each question, I want you to pause the video and write down your answer. First of all, what type of greenhouse structure is this? Number 2, please draw an even span greenhouse and an uneven span greenhouse. What's the difference? Number 3, please label the parts of the greenhouse. A, B, C, and D. And finally, what direction should I have the greatest roof surface area of my greenhouse facing in the ideal situation? If you had trouble with the last question, here's some diagrams that may help you. In conclusion, we covered the basic plant growth requirements, the purpose of a greenhouse, the types of greenhouses, different parts of greenhouses, and other greenhouse type structures. Additional information is included in this lecture, which you can go through on your own, such as more do-it-yourself greenhouse ideas and information on how to build greenhouses and different materials that you can use, temperature controls, and different options for that. I hope you enjoyed. As always, feel free to ask questions. Thank you so much.